Welcome, everyone, here to our next conversation at the EU Pavilion at COP28, Clean Tech for Net Zero. Before we get started, I just wanted to say this is a silent conference, so I encourage you all to put up your headsets because you will be much more easily able to hear. So my name is Lee Beck. I'm the Senior Director for Europe and the Middle East at the Clean Air Task Force. For those of you who don't know us, we're a global climate organization focusing on overlooked solutions. We're also investigating the hard questions at the nexus of energy access, climate action, and geopolitics in the Zero Carbon Future Pavilion in B7, Building 88. For this event, and I'm really grateful that the European Commission is actually bringing us here together the second year in a row for this discussion. We're really looking to bring together governments and international clean tech players to share experiences with supporting green growth and technology. I think from my perspective, this conversation couldn't come at a better place or time. After all, we've seen a massive increase in clean tech deployment ambition here at COP28. 3x renewables, 2x energy efficiency, 3x nuclear, a carbon management challenge. And the key question now, again, is how will we deliver on these pledges and actually move to plans, and how can policy in particular help unlock finance and infrastructure? And I think one insight from the many conversations we've had here at COP already is that we're not actually doing enough knowledge sharing on deployment policies and approaches. However, the faster we do share, and this is why this is an exciting group to come together, the faster countries can help each other to optimize their approaches and tools for decarbonization. And of course, the faster we can deploy, bring down costs, and reduce emissions. So for this conversation, what has worked and what hasn't, and which constraints and chances are there in different regions of the world? How can we work together to push a faster rate of clean tech deployment globally and avoid a subsidy race? Before we get started, I just wanted to say we're going to collect audience questions online and here in the room with Slido. We'll be showing a QR code in just a second. And I also invite you to join the conversation online with the hashtag EU@COP28. And with this, we're going to jump into the opening remarks, after which we're going to have a panel discussion. So I'll introduce my panelists. I'm really honored to have to my left Kurt Vandenberge, who is the Director General of DG Climate Action at the European Commission, Leslie Masdorp, who is the Vice President and CFO of the New Development Bank, Andrew Light, the Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy, and last but not least, Firas Al-Abdouani, who is the Director General for Renewable Energy and Hydrogen at the Ministry of Energy and Minerals of the Sultanate of Oman. Kurt, I would like to invite you to give your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining this panel this afternoon. Thank you for coming to our EU Pavilion to have this discussion, this conversation on an essential subject for our future. Global climate action is really a global agenda for growth, innovation, and investment. When we launched the European Green Deal in 2019, it was really designed as a growth strategy, a new growth strategy, because we know that growth based on fossil fuels and on wastage of resources is obsolete. We cannot grow our economy on that basis. And we see this is the case for the whole world, looking at how climate change is galloping now. So climate action at global level, this COP is actually about enhancing prosperity, making sure that our economy grows, that there is prosperity for all within the planetary boundaries. And I think we can say this is working. If we see that there are more than 100,000 people here at COP28 in Dubai, this is about climate, of course, but much more than climate. It's about creating a new economy. It's about creating a new financial framework that makes that transition happening as much as possible to a clean energy and a clean economy. And it's clear that the global market for green products, for clean energy, will be growing massively. Certainly the EU market in the future, with all the regulations and policies we have put in place, will be massive for green products, clean tech, and green services. When we launched the Green Deal in 2019, we felt a bit alone. Today, we see that actually Europe risks being overtaken by the rest of the world. If we look at what is happening in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, if we look at what is happening in China, that is investing more in renewable energy than the rest of the world combined, and Africa is the latest continent that has said it wants to be the continent of solutions for the green transition. So what we need now is massively grow clean tech investments in the EU and across the world, everywhere. And that requires that we look at the right framework conditions to especially have the scale up of investments that we need to really scale the new innovations for clean energy, for a green economy in the future. For us, it's very clear in Europe, implementing what we have agreed in terms of ambitious targets for 2030 is in fact an investment agenda. It's really about massive, substantial investment. We, of course, base a lot on our investment on carbon pricing. We put a price on pollution with the emission trading system, and that gives a strong incentive to our economic operators to invest in alternatives so that they are not hit by the price of pollution. We also look at how we can best help de-risk investment with a use of public spending, which we have to do in the smartest, most possible way possible in order to bring the costs down, to create new markets, but also, and that's why we're here, to encourage global cooperation and technology transfers in a way that we obviously respect the international frameworks for intellectual property protection, etc., but also in a way that we avoid lock-ins, carbon lock-ins in sectors that have long investment lead times. In the European Commission, DG Clima is among the service I have the privilege to lead. DG Clima is now among the strongest advocates for a modern, smart, green industrial strategy, because we know that we create this massive market for clean products in the future in Europe. We cannot sustain our climate ambition if that market is also not supplied from within Europe. But that doesn't mean that our market will not be open for products and technologies and solutions from the rest of the world. The greener, the more open the European market will be. From DG Clima, we contribute to this with the Innovation Fund, which is the largest fund for decarbonizing industry and funding clean tech in the world, resourced by the revenues from emission trading. We are moving gradually from only breakthrough innovation also to the deployment of innovative solutions, renewable energy, energy storage, carbon capture and storage, industrial decarbonization, and increasingly also clean tech manufacturing. So far, we have funded 111 projects for a total amount of 6.6 billion euros. These calls, the 3 calls we have done and completed, were oversubscribed 6 times. So we could have funded 6 times more, which of course is a bad message because it means all these projects that we have received we cannot fund. But it's also a very good message because it shows that the pipeline of projects for decarbonizing our economy and for decarbonizing industry, the pipeline is full. We really have now to move to the next phase where we have all the money that we need. We have 40 billion left for the rest of this decade, which we will use smartly. We will also look at how other European programs and member states can come in to augment the scale of the Innovation Fund in a one window, one-stop shop for all investment in the industrial decarbonization in Europe. And we are experimenting with new ways of investing through auctions. We have recently launched the first ever auction, a competitive bidding mechanism at the EU level for the funding support to the production of renewable hydrogen. And this is something that makes us in the European Commission very excited. So I think what we need now is more of this in Europe and more of this across the world. And we are here very much keen to learn from others. We have fantastic champions from other parts of the world, the US, Oman, the BRICS states. I'm very convinced, together with my colleagues, that we can learn a lot from our partners and friends. Climate change is not only happening, it is galloping. But at the same time, the opportunities for clean tech and clean tech scale-up and investment are also growing very, very quickly. So time is of the essence. Cooperation is as much of the essence at global level. And I would say that global climate cooperation, also for industrial decarbonization, is probably the best and only de-risking strategy for humanity on this planet and for the future of our economy at the global level in the world. So thank you very much for this panel.
Thank you very much for these incredible remarks, DG Vandenbergen. Climate change is galloping and cooperation our best option. Leslie, I want to go over to you. For our audience, I think we'd like to a little bit better understand what is the mandate of the new development bank and where do you see your clean tech portfolio going with regards to climate action?
Thank you very much for having me. And let me start out by firstly just highlighting the important role that the European Union have in a global context. You have considerable advantages globally. One, you have far-sighted, visionary policymakers like Kurt here. You have a single market. You have a continent with a clear objective to be carbon neutral, the first continent by 2050. You probably have the most advanced policy and regulatory framework in place. That imposes, in my view, coming from the emerging markets, a huge also responsibility on the European Union to codify best practices, to codify the sort of lessons from your experience so that we in turn can learn from that. I mentioned that specifically because there's a great risk of a major divergence emerging between the three major blocs, the United States, the European Union, and China on the one hand, who have the most advanced policy frameworks in place, and then the rest of the world. And I come from South Africa and also would like to bring in the perspectives from Africa as I make these remarks. The next point I'd like to make before I come to the New Development Bank specifically is to talk about the development finance industry more broadly. New Development Bank is part of a much bigger development finance community who have gone through a series of reflections which has been codified in a few reports, one by the G20, which essentially suggests that over the next 5 to 10 years, we will significantly alter and change the course we have been on. In the past, we have been financing large projects, largely backed by sovereign, by governments, in other words. We are moving away to finance more portfolios rather than individual projects. We will also in future, instead of funding big projects, we will try to play a much more catalytic role. Kurt has just mentioned or highlighted the importance of deploying public funds in a smart manner. Smart in this context means using it in such a manner that we can crowd in more institutional capital. The biggest theme of COP26, in particular in Glasgow, with Mark Carney driving that agenda, was about how to effectively mobilize private sector capital. That was 2 years ago. We are now at a stage of looking at what are the further inhibitors, what is blocking the large volumes of private capital from coming into the clean tech space and into low carbon technologies. So coming to the New Development Bank in particular, we were set up by the BRICS countries, so we represent very large emerging markets: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Egypt has just joined the bank, Bangladesh, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia is also about to join. So we represent very much the peculiar but large emerging markets who, as you know, constitutes almost 2/3 of global carbon emissions. We want to be part of the solutions, but I think we also look at the carbon, or rather we look at this as a major opportunity for our economies. As Europe decarbonizes, there's massive potential in the development and manufacturing of solar panels, wind turbines, all of the manufacturing capability, the entire ecosystem to make the vision that Kurt outlined work requires manufacturing capability where we have differential comparative advantage, specifically China and some of the large markets in Africa, where we're hoping to be producing a lot of the inputs into that manufacturing ecosystem for Europe. The next point I'd like to make is around this very important theme that Kurt touched on, which is around de-risking. One of the most important barriers we have discovered why not more money is flowing into the clean tech space is because many institutional investors, the risk return profile, and they're not comfortable with venture capital, they're not comfortable with greenfields. So we as a development finance community want to take a lot more of that upfront risk. We want to de-risk in such a manner that the projects then meet the risk return objectives of a lot of the institutional investors. In short, what we want to do is get also much more involved, what we call upstream, meaning helping countries define the appropriate policy conditions. Because in many countries, the reason why investments are not flowing is because you do not have an enabling macro environment. And in this context, we believe we can learn a lot from the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this description of your mandate, but I think what's really important, what you're outlining is the emerging tension of industrial policy versus comparative advantages. So I hope we can go into this discussion a little bit more during this panel. Assistant Secretary Light, I want to go over to you. Of course, the U.S. has passed historic policy with the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and projects on next-gen tech are emerging everywhere in the United States. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of an overview of what kind of action you're seeing, but also, obviously, there's multiple agencies involved, but really DOE's mandate and DOE's approach to financing clean tech.
Thanks very much, Lee, and it's great to be here with everyone. I have to say, Leslie, it's really very kind of you, and I'm so grateful that you mentioned us in the same breath with China and Europe as having one of the most advanced policy frameworks on climate and clean energy in the world. Seriously, in December 2021, that was not true. And so the transformation has truly been very, very fast. It needed to be. We were behind, seriously behind, and we had withdrawn, frankly, from the world with respect to cooperation on helping everyone else to get there. And obviously we know it's been a tough 2 years in the world for lots of reasons. But what I'm greatly heartened by is how in the midst of all of this, we've managed to keep the decarbonization agenda, Kurt, I think it was reflected in your points, still clearly in front of us, for all of us, and that is really something, frankly. So, Leah, it's hard to be brief to answer that question, but I'll do my very, very level best and try not to bury everyone in a blizzard of numbers. But it is a blizzard of numbers because things have moved very fast. So the two major pieces of legislation, the acronyms BILL and IRA. BILL was 2021, so that's the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, which was the biggest long-term investment we've ever made in infrastructure in U.S. history. And it's all clean energy across the board, renewables, nuclear, decarbonize fossil energy, hydrogen, fuels of the future, all of that. And then IRA 2022, which is the tax credit part, which originally, we would put that in the hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of the investment, and it's tax credits on the production and the consumption side. But because of the uptake of this, it's actually closer to $1 trillion is what we expect in terms of what the payout of IRA is going to be. And it's making everything cheaper and more abundant, certainly in the United States, and we hope that this spreads intentionally throughout the world to drive everything down in terms of cost for the range of clean energy solutions. If you have a badge and get into the room, I'd encourage you to see the U.S. presentation tomorrow afternoon. when we present our voluntary biennial report update. When we did our biennial report last year, we just had like the top lines on the numbers, and now we actually can measure the impact both in terms of greenhouse gas reductions and in terms of, like, again, the amount of cost. So the top line there is 40, we're going to get to 41% by 2050 with what we've set in motion in the last 2 years, and we certainly will be able to, I think, to close that gap with the ways that many states have come along to help that and the private sector. The combination of what that does domestically, and then I'll get to DOE, the combination there on IRA alone and bill saves American families $38 billion on electricity bills, as I said, reduce greenhouse gases 40%, double the share of American electricity generated by clean sources to 80% by 2030, which will get us in line to meet the president's goal of clean electricity by 2035, reducing industrial and manufacturing emissions up to 40%. And the most impressive thing is, and again, think about how fast capital can move when it's incentivized to move. So again, in less than 2 years, $150 billion in new clean energy investments in battery, electric vehicle, solar, and offshore wind manufacturing arenas alone. Those are new build plants. I grew up in Georgia, southern state of Georgia. I can't tell you how many friends of friends now work in EV battery manufacturing plants built by the Koreans. 2 plants already, a third one coming up, and that's one state. Transform the economy of one state. And what we hope with all that, again, is it drives down the cost. And I think that here, I would sort of say, just on the side of it, no one who's lived through the last 2 years, no one who wants to see a clean energy transition would be opposed to the maximum diversification of supply chains for clean energy. We have to see that. And that's from the critical mineral side all the way through to, you know, the manufactured technologies themselves. And here we're committed to using the authority under these 2 pieces of legislation to do that. Just a week ago, President Biden announced a new White House task force on this, 38 different subcommittees to try to accelerate that so that we can friend-shore, we can do everything we can to maximize that capacity. Now, the Department of Energy itself, my department, it's a huge transformation there. We have, at this point, we have $400 billion into my agency alone. We had to hire 1,000 new people to get the money out the door to make sure it gets out by the end of this term of this administration. Push it out there, make sure it gets spent. The tax credits under IRA are 10-year tax credits, so of course we are rapidly pushing out the legislation, not the legislation, but the interpretation of the legislation to make sure that Americans can take credit for that, and again, unleash the industries that will be stimulated by that. Just in our loan program office alone, again, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars in the loan program office, which is used to, again, stimulate and close that gap between innovation and deployment, approaching, what China, for example, has been able to do, and I think being competitive. And we hope doing this in such a way that is sensitive to the needs of our allies, working with them on many ways in which we can interpret these regulations flexibly enough to be able to move forward. So this has created 60 new programs in my department, 16 demonstration, and 32 deployment programs. And it just kind of goes on and on. I'll kind of stop there, but I would say the answer, Lee, is a lot, both for what we've done to unleash this in the US and what it's done to transform my department, which had primarily been mostly on the R&D side, is now fully engaged on the deployment and infrastructure side. And that's critically important because you need a country to use its resources wisely, and I think we're finally catching up, as I said, with other world leaders on that.
Thank you, Andrew. And I just want to reiterate how incredible this, what I would say, institutional evolution is, not only from a mandate perspective, moving from R&D to actually deployment, but also the administrative capacity and skills you had to bring in during a time where there was a labor shortage overall. So I would like to go to you, DG Al-Abdouani, and ask, what is Oman's vision for decarbonization? Which technologies are you focusing on? And also, you've been able to attract a lot of foreign direct investment in your clean energy sector. So I'd love to kind of for the audience to better understand what your key action items are from this perspective.
Sure. Thank you very much for hosting me and for the interesting question. So when we look at Oman, and I hope you can hear me better now, we're in a unique position where we have been blessed with hydrocarbons, and we still are, which has been the fuel of our economy, but we're also equally endowed with renewable energy resources. So for us, ideally, the transition should be, at least from a resource perspective, an easy match. It really becomes now more to the policies and the human interaction of how we enable that. So the elements we're looking at are multi-pronged. We're starting with energy efficiency. We believe that is one of the first tools that we need to deploy because that's one of the lowest hanging fruits. And there are challenges associated with that. And we always need to go back to the context of each country. In our case, because of the richness we had in hydrocarbons, we also have a situation where a lot of the prices are not cost reflective. So we had the variability of cost of generation that is not visible to the end consumers, which make solutions such as energy efficiency quite difficult to deploy. And that moves then to the next thing, which is the electricity market design itself. So this itself is a solution, because at the moment we have a system that has been in place for over a decade, close to 2 decades. And like many of the markets out there, it was suitable for a dispatchable energy generation. And now with the intermittency of renewable energy, that becomes a challenge. And then we move to renewable energy itself. If you look at Oman, which is very rich, we have over 65,000 kilometers of land that is suitable for renewable energy. 50,000 of them are rich in both wind and solar. To put that in context, that's around the size of Netherlands and Belgium, I'm told. So it's a large geographic area that is suitable for renewable energy. It provides more than 5 to 10 times of the electricity that Oman would need by 2050. So that's a huge potential that we need to harness. And now when we look at it, Oman today, only 4% of our electricity is actually generated from renewable energy. So there's a gap that we need to address. And then we move on to hydrogen, and we're looking at different forms of hydrogen. Green, of course, where we started late, but we moved very quickly by orchestrating the market design itself, creating Hydrogen Oman Hydrom as a facilitator, which enabled the attraction of the foreign direct investment you mentioned. So we put a clear structure of who is responsible for what. We made it clear that we are open to multitude of solutions, so we did not fix the end products, but allow the market themselves to decide what it is. But we put some terms and conditions of what is expected from each developers to engage in a competitive tension market where different auctions can be successful. And we were. Every auction has been oversubscribed, and we've been able to announce projects which are in the studies phase now. And then the last thing is carbon markets themselves. So we don't have a carbon market. This is essential. It's an externality that unless it's costed for, then there's no real equity provided to the different elements engaged. So we have a huge file that we need to address to be able to meet things, particularly if we look at our carbon emissions from the markets, and if we want to engage with the Europeans, and if we don't have a carbon price, then that carbon captured will not be considered biogenic or suitable for integration into other clean products. So we have our internal drivers, and then we have the external market drivers that are pushing us to come up with diverse solutions.
Thank you very much. And there's 2 pieces from this first round of conversation that I want to pick up. One is the emphasis on global cooperation. So what can we learn from each other? The other piece is carbon markets, CBAM. There's already audience questions rolling in on CBAM, so please everyone be ready. I will just want to invite the audience online and here at COP28 to submit questions. So DG Van den Berge, I want to go back to you. We've heard how the EU approaches clean tech funding, innovation fund, a lot of activities, really exciting, a lot of technologies as well. But having heard your counterparts and colleagues, what do you think the EU can learn from others, or where are you looking for best practices?
Well, thank you, Lee. First of all, I am very encouraged by everything that I hear here this afternoon. Secondly, we can learn so much from each other. I would like to learn from Andrew, for example, how he got the mandate and resources to recruit 1,000 people. I can only dream of having 1,000 more people at DG Klima. We could do wonders with this. But jokes aside, or maybe only half jokes, I think there's so much we can learn about how to get the whole framework together, as colleagues were saying. Because attracting these investments, mobilizing these investments, there's no silver bullet for this. You need a whole regulatory and policy framework, looking at the price of things, looking at supply chains, giving the predictability to investors, so that there is a return on investment and that projects become bankable. And there's no silver bullet to this. You really need to go through a whole framework of measures. And there I think we can learn a lot from each other, how we're all doing this, acknowledging that we all have different starting positions, and then how do we make sure, as you said, Lee, we use the comparative advantages that we have, but do it in a way that we all benefit from it, because this climate challenge is a global challenge, and we will need to do this together. We work together, and we act together, or we swim together in the future.
Great, thank you. And going back to comparative advantage, Leslie, you mentioned manufacturing capacity in emerging markets for deploying, supplying the increasing deployment ambitions in advanced economies like the EU and the US. So perhaps I'd love to talk to you a bit, or I'd love to hear from you a little bit more. What can these markets do to provide certainty so we really move towards a world where we have more reliable supply chains and partnerships?
Let me start out by saying that the last few years, specifically COP, has done considerable damage. Can you hear me? You can. The last few years, especially the difficult times the world economy went through during COVID, has done a lot of damage with regards to an emerging or growing and deepening trust deficit between the advanced economies, individual countries. As you know, during COVID, many countries started to kind of reconsider whether they want to rely on supply chains from some markets in Asia, in particular, for example, China. I think it's very important to recognize that there is a geopolitical backdrop which is challenging. And we have to admit that we are still, in the midst of, very high energy prices, very high, tension in the sort of geopolitical landscape. But the climate agenda unites us all. So that's the starting point. The second point that I'd like to make is that there is huge advantage in these three major blocks that I referred to: United States, China, and European Union, kind of leading and going ahead, because you can set the policy frameworks in place that can help emerging markets respond. I'll give you one or two brief examples. United Kingdom in 2021, for the first time in, I don't know how long, put in place in their central bank mandate the words net zero, which means the Bank of England, when they make decisions on monetary policy, they have to take into account not just economic growth and unemployment and inflation and other variables, they have to take into account the broader macro objective around net zero. Similarly, as Basel reconfigures the rules for central banks, that which is really led by the advanced economies in Europe and so on, that will also make it possible for emerging markets to sort of look at where the major innovations are happening globally. The third major point that I'd like to make is there's also significant changes underway in the entire way in which finance is configured. For example, there is currently a process underway to look at, for the introduction of impact accounting measures. You might know that in 1933, when we established the first globally accepted accounting standards, it had a revolutionary impact in harmonizing the way we look at accounting. Similarly now, there's an emerging recognition that we need to take into account companies' emission footprints as we look at their financial long-term sustainability. So when you do rate of return, when you look at rather valuation analysis of companies, you need to factor in stranded assets, for example. A company can be very profitable today, but if it has long-term environmental liabilities, that will impact on their share price at the end of the day. I guess what I'm suggesting is that this divergence between developed world and the emerging markets has its downsides, in a sense that it leaves many countries behind, but it also creates an enabling environment for us to play faster catch-up in the emerging markets. To come specifically to your question around comparative advantage, we have the advantage that our labor markets, we have cheaper supply of labor in many developing countries. Our inputs are cheaper. So for a long time, China will remain the principal producer of solar panels because it's very difficult for anyone else to produce solar panels at those rates. But we need to make sure that we can establish supply chains in all the other areas where we need to scale up. For example, battery storage technologies is emerging very, very fast. So the production of electric, the inputs for electric vehicles, electrolyzers for hydrogen, solar panels, and so on. A lot of that can be done in places like Africa. I guess the final point I'd like to make, again, just to make the punt around the just transition, I think we must recognize, as we do all of this policy work, that there is an imperative to ensure that the elements or the principles of the just transition remains embedded in our work. Africa, for example, have something like 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, 1.2 billion people. So the industrialization of a lot of our economies have been slowed down because we have coal under the ground, but we have more than 500 million people without sustainable supply of electricity. And this is where I want to make a final comment as the question came up, as you said, about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I think it is very important for Europe to recognize this historical and moral culpability, or rather responsibility, that Europe have to recognize that the emerging markets have a different starting point in our industrialization process, and we need to make sure that as you put in place this advanced sort of framework with the CBAM, that you do not create the conditions for what I would argue could be the source of future trade tensions around the green growth strategies. So Europe needs to make sure that we do not have trade tensions that emanate from the clean and green growth environment.
Leslie, thank you so much for, I think, this really important remark towards you, and maybe we can come back to this if we have time. I will say that energy access is the first building block for climate action and the first line of defense against the impacts of climate change. Andrew, I want to go to you. Everything you've heard, and you said your last words on your last remarks were, we want to make sure that IRA and bipartisan infrastructure law also deliver emissions reductions abroad through bringing down costs of technology. What's the role of global collaboration, and what's your response based on what you've already heard on the panel?
So the way that we look at this is, and if you were to look at the portfolio of just my office in the Department of Energy, we're over 30 bilateral cooperation partnerships, such as the US-EU Energy Council, which is a sort of a 2+2. So it's the foreign minister and the energy minister on both sides meeting together, country by country, huge cooperation platforms with most of the BRICS countries, and then a series of also targeted MOUs. And I have to, Firas, we were just talking beforehand, the first ever workshop and MOU signing on geologic hydrogen. I didn't even know geologic hydrogen was a thing until one of my guys came to me and sort of said, yes, we're going to go to Oman, we're going to do this workshop in geologic hydrogen, and we're going to see an MOU signing between Eden, a US company, and Oman to develop this resource. And it's like, wow, that's incredible. But the organizing, there's two organizing theories that we have on this. One is that technology partnerships cannot just be technology partnerships for the sake of exploring technology and talking about regulatory frameworks. You've got to be creating stuff that includes the finance piece from the beginning in order to have any demonstrable impact whatsoever. And so the one example I'll give you is our kind of the most ambitious thing we do with any country is through what we call the Net Zero World Partnership, which was created as part of the G7 Partnership on Global Infrastructure, announced a couple of years ago when the UK had the G7 chair. And through that program, I said, DOE, before the transformation that IRA and Bill, those two pieces of legislation, did to our department, we were mostly an R&D kind of focused organization. And the biggest part of that, tens of thousands of people, work in 17 national laboratories run by the Department of Energy. So a subset of 10 of those national laboratories created a kind of an inter-lab partnership run out of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado. And through that, we've offered, originally Glasgow 2 years ago, to 6 countries, a partnership that would create dedicated teams across those 10 labs to create technology pathways to get to net zero, combined with investment strategies. So it's not just the technology, it's a technology that will attract the most private and public capital. So we started with Chile, Argentina, Egypt, Nigeria, Indonesia, Ukraine. Since then, we've added Singapore and Thailand with the hope of creating an ASEAN sort of hub. And short story on this is, and it's not just sort of we're waiting, we give them like 5 years and they write a report and they throw it over the transom. It's a constant churning out of policies and measures. And that has created 22 now being implemented policies and measures to accelerate clean energy transitions across a variety of sectors chosen by the countries, and has created a pipeline. And this program for each country is single millions of dollars to do this analysis, is created a pipeline of $10 billion of outside finance. And that's the kind of leverage you need. And it's the only happens when you build in, right, that combined public-private sector part at the beginning of it. And the second thing I'll say, the second example I'll give you, is that we want to target diversification of clean energy supply chains to bring more players into the clean energy supply chain network. So just yesterday, the proudest announcement I have of anything that the US government, frankly, has announced, well, I won't say that, that would get me in trouble. The Department of Energy has announced at this COP, yesterday we signed an MOU with Mauritania. And his MOU focused on helping them to indigenize, create their own indigenous green steel production capacity. Mauritania produces iron, and Mauritania has an energy poverty rate of below 50%. Mauritania produces iron. All that iron goes outside to somewhere else in the world. It is turned into steel. The carbon content of that steel is greater than the emissions of Mauritania. That's bad. That is not a sustainable model to get to net zero, to have a sustainable planet. So what we've sort of figured out, because Mauritania also has some of the biggest proven reserves of solar and wind that can be turned into green hydrogen, help them to bring that, keep that steel at home, and then use a DOE incubated technology to create blast furnaces that do not run on coal, that we incubated through, hundreds of millions of dollars of research over the years, that can create a green steel production facility, which will have a market in Europe thanks to the innovative legislation in Europe. And that's the kind of thinking, that's what we want to do with our resources, to create more players in the clean energy supply chain network with our international cooperation.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Light. And I think our suspense is ratcheting up on CBAM, but first I want to go to you, DG Al-Abdouani. Having heard your counterparts and colleagues, and knowing that Oman is really focused on bilateral relationships and partnerships for clean tech deployment, can you give us a little bit of an overview of whom are you looking for best practices and learnings globally?
We're quite forward open, internationally open to all the different geographies and economic blocks that we look into. So whether it is the US, the European Union, China, BRICS, or other elements, we try to find what is suitable. It's all contextual. So for us, we also look at the end market that we want to cooperate with, because that drives elements. We look at the technology suppliers, and we try to derive the learnings from them so that whatever solutions we take are compatible with the end connection that we want to achieve. So when it comes to electrification, we look quite a bit towards Europe, looking at the electricity market systems over there. We're also looking at the US to look at the counterpoints over there. When it comes to the hydrogen ecosystem, it's primarily been driven today in Oman by the partnerships that we see coming primarily from Europe as well as from Southeast Asia. So it's really the matching of supply and demand that is driving where we look forward to. So there's a reactive part from our side, having these outreaches from the other parts, but there are some elements where we go and seek ourselves the best practices. When it comes to other elements, we look at capability development, certifications. These elements, these are really pan-international. So this morning there was the signing of the mutual recognition of certification with regards to the hydrogen. For us, that is extremely important, and this will also create an international forum for capturing best practices, because now we have different parties with their own views, each country's sovereign decision on what suits them works. But then by interacting and having work groups together that go through a process will help build and foster the best practices. So I will keep it at that, as I see we've run out of time and you want to open the door for questions.
Thank you very much. We luckily have more time for questions, and I want to go to a lightning round on CBAM. Obviously, it's now moving forward in the European Union. There's innovative proposals in US Congress, but there's also clear demands to ensure that it's not leads to a essentially regulatory exclusion from emerging markets who want to sell their products but don't have the funding to deliver clean tech transformation at the pace and scale that advanced economies can. So we'll go down lightning round, 1 minute or less, so we can get another question, a couple of questions in.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. I'm happy to have a chance to say something about CBAM. First, I should say CBAM is part of our climate ambition, and it's an integral part of Europe taking responsibility for a fast decarbonization. CBAM is there because we want to go more quickly, as quickly as possible in decarbonizing our industry. That's why we are gradually taking away the free allowances that we have under emission trading system for the sectors like steel, aluminium, etc. But we don't want to have carbon leakage. We don't want to export the pollution, the carbon emissions, to the rest of the world. So that's why we introduced CBAM, which is very much directed at companies, not at countries. It is entirely non-distortive. So any company that comes with a low carbon product will not be hit by ETS or by CBAM. And any price that is paid abroad will be deducted from a CBAM levy. And so in this way, it's actually a tool for the rest of the world to work together in decarbonizing our industries and our industrial sectors. And we are very encouraged that we see an increasing interest across the world for carbon pricing, which we want to promote. We want to help countries to introduce carbon pricing or an emission trading system. We have launched a call to action on Paris-aligned carbon markets. And the more jurisdictions integrate and introduce carbon pricing, the more CBAM will become a joint tool, a joint instrument for decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors like steel, cement, aluminium, and many others. So for us, this is really a tool of very ambitious climate policy and a tool that shows that Europe is taking its responsibility. And it's not always easy for our own industries in Europe, because it does mean that there is an increased cost for our industries in the global economy. So it is actually not something that helps ourselves, but helps the climate.
Just very briefly from my side, I think Curtis correctly outlined the sort of vision and ambition from the European side, but I think the devil is in the detail. I mean, at the sort of basic starting point level, many emerging markets see the CBAM as, if you like, potentially discriminatory in the sense that it imposes a tax on those of our economies. I'll give you a brief 30-second example. I come from South Africa, and South Africa is maybe the 36th, 37th biggest economy in the world and about the 12th biggest carbon emitter. We've got one entity called Eskom that produces most of our electricity. And therefore, the content of the production of whether it's our cars or all of our labor-intensive goods that we export to Europe will now have a tax imposed on it, which will potentially make us uncompetitive in many goods. We need to kind of find a formulation within the detail to ensure that the legislation does have the intended outcome, as Kurt has just highlighted, which is that it can potentially help put in place a global framework. But at this stage, many of our countries, including Brazil, China, India, see this and have indicated to the World Trade Organization that this has discriminatory elements inherent in it.
In the same way that I was incredibly encouraged to see, look, when we first rolled out our Inflation Reduction Act, we got a lot of letters in the mail from some countries, and regions of the world on this with some concerns, and we had good constructive conversations, and we dealt with those and worked on them, and I was incredibly heartened to see that many countries decided to do similar kinds of initiatives. In the same way, as someone who has followed CBAM very, very closely in and outside of government over the last 20 years, really, in the development of the idea, I am, for one, incredibly encouraged that members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, as we say in the US, Republicans and Democrats, are looking at similar measures and taking them seriously for a world that is definitely going to be transformed on this. So I appreciate also the concerns that some have voiced, and I think that we're finally ready for this conversation.
Thank you. From my perspective, I believe CBAM is a double-edged sword. So there are very clear positive elements. It acts as a nucleus for the rest of the world to coalesce around. And that's the positive aspect of CBAM from my perspective. But there is also potentially a negative side to CBAM that needs to be addressed. And if it's addressed, then I think you will find more cohesive and support behind it. There's an issue of timing and framing the inclusivity of CBAM itself. Because if you take a snapshot and say, yes, our borders are open so long as you meet, it does not really account for the historic emissions. And I know I'm sitting in an audience here where we're EU, most of the people sitting here are from the developed world, but there's an issue for the developing nations saying, okay, yes, we are addressing a global issue, but we have not really contributed so much to it, and we need to have the tools. So if in tandem we have solutions such as the fund that is supposed to support the developing nations really enacted, then that becomes, then CBAM becomes acceptable. Without having tools to allow developing nations to really also achieve their economic aspirations that they have not been able to do historically, then that is a negativity that will be a challenge to accept for the developing nations. I would like to take the example that Andrew gave of the US helping Mauritania. So right now, when we look at these also industrialization and aspiration, the economic, social aspiration that developing nations have, if CBAM is done in such a way that helps them, where some of the industries, the hard-to-abate industries, actually shift, rather than having a push to always take their natural resources, now in the form of a renewable resource, turned into molecules and exported to the developing nations, further supporting their economies, but actually having an equitable system where some of that development happens in developing nations, allowing and supporting the developing nations in producing end products or intermediate products rather than energy carriers, and then introducing those into the European Union and other markets. That would be more equitable, and then CBAM will be seen as a positive tool rather than a negative one.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much. I think this could be its conversation on its own, but I really, really appreciate these honest perspectives from all of you on the vision that the EU has put forward with the CBAM. So as we're really running out of time, unfortunately now, I do want to end with a positive note with everyone. So again, another lightning round in, say, 3 to 30 words. What are the most important steps as we're thinking? We've heard about geopolitical fragmentation, supply chain issues, but also positive stories where we've overcome indifferences, particularly on a transatlantic basis. What are the most important steps we can take together to advance clean tech deployment globally? 3 to 30 words.
Well, that's quite a challenge, Lee. What I would say is that this COP is really showing that it's not an if we go to decarbonization, but how and how quickly. And I think we now have really a global frame for discussing how we best do this all together, because as was said by my colleagues here on this panel, we really have to do this together. We can learn from each other, and the more we do it together, the quicker we scale up the investments that we need. And there is, as I said, no one size fits all. There is no silver bullet. We all have to do it in our own way, but with having this global common agenda in mind.
I think very briefly, I think there's a lot, as I said, we can learn from Europe, in particular on the sort of policy front. But I think codifying and putting out there a very clear exposition of what a green industrial strategy, a modern one, looks like that emerging markets can replicate.
To me, it's massive. It's catalyzing massive amounts of private sector capital at scale to be focused on clean energy, especially in the parts of the world where that money is not currently going. It is absolutely appalling to me that the cost of capital is so high in Africa when it's so low in other parts of the world. We need to see, we can make transformations happen. I mean, there are some things in the climate and clean energy debate we were wrong about, and I'm really glad we're wrong about. For example, how fast solar will become so ridiculously cheap and become cost competitive with every better, right, outcompete fossil energy in almost every part of the world. The example of India, we could talk about for hours and hours, and it's astonishing. And it's incredibly successful. And we need more examples like that. And that means that everyone in government and the IFIs needs to be working and doing everything we can to de-risk and move that capital in the right direction and diversify it and get more players in it. I'm going over 30 words, but I'll just say one quick thing, because we've talked about all over the halls of this, and we know it. The IEA report on oil and gas that came out shortly before this COP unfortunately gave the statistic that the oil and gas industry is, in terms of its investment in renewable energies, at 1%. 1%. Some of the richest companies in the world. So they don't have an obligation, right, to make that investment, but we need to make it clear that there is enormous opportunity that they're missing on. And if we can't make that clear, we're not doing our jobs.
From my perspective, I believe if we recognize the wants and gives of each different participating nation, and then placing them on a bargaining mattress, and we look at them and then find what is equitable and what are the potential blockers that are there to unlock them. And I think forums such as this one, such as what COP offer, really enable us to have these kind of dialogues and identifying the solutions that are collaborative and equitable in nature.
Yeah, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're already at the end of this really incredible panel at, I think, in the right place and at the right time. So I just want to summarize a few thoughts that I've jotted down and want to thank my panelists and the audience from online for being really, really engaged. But I think, as you said it, DG Vandenbergen, climate change is galloping, and it's really about the how and how quickly. And we've laid out a global frame, but fault lines persist. One size doesn't fit all, and we need to emphasize diplomacy to overcome differences as we're trying to find our way as countries and actors within global fragmentation and supply chain issues. And I think it's really about how can we, and there is really good ideas here. Leslie, you talked about green industrial strategies, potentially tweaking policies to adjust the timing and framing to bring along emerging markets and close those fault lines that have really emerged over the past couple of years, but also continuing to ensure that we're future-proofing some of the investments as we're heading into headwinds such as high interest rates and more riskier environments. So I will stop here. I'd like to join you all for, thank you all for joining us. And I think we're gonna have more programming here in the pavilion and hoping that next year we can come back for another round of clean tech for net zero. Thank you very much.